Wanted to look over the engine on the forwarder a little, since it's a little cranky to start sometimes, especially when it's been sitting for a couple of days. So started by removing the air filter. There is a sensor on it to see if it's clogged, and a couple of hose clamps, and the entire assembly can be lifted off. Next off, I started spraying some of the rusty bolts, since I'm gonna replace the exhaust manifold that's cracked and broken. Next up was the coolant expansion tank for the coolant, removing some of the hoses that connect to it. There is one at the bottom. Pulled that off, and caught was in there in a bucket. Removed the sensor for low level. Two bolts on the side and a bracket holding up both where the air filter and the coolant bottle is mounted, and all of that can be lifted out of the way to expose more of the engine. And with better access to the fuel injectors and stuff, I use some compressed air and try to get some dust out of there. Next up, the muffler needed to come undone. Some of the bolts were a little stuck on there, but most of them here came off without too much trouble. A couple of bigger bolts and nuts holding the bracket that's holding the exhaust, the pipe and the muffler in place. Nothing hard about them, they came undone quite easily. Undoing the last one, and you can see it starting to move a little compared to the turbo. And then it's just a matter of being able to lift it. It's a little on the heavy side, and getting that last bolt out. Just had a small little burner, but added some heat to some of the rusty nuts holding the turbo in place. I'm not sure how much that little bit of heat helped, but once I started seeing some smoke, I tried undoing them, and the two on this side actually came undone. Needed to remove the oil pipes feeding the lubrication for the turbo, and as usual the adapter that's threaded into the engine block started moving instead of the coupling, so had to be able to get two tools in there to hold the adapter while undoing the coupling on it, and that was a little tricky. Then the bolts for the actual oil pipes, both the feed and the return, they are a little tricky to access, but came undone quite easily. Here is the upper one, it's no problem. And with everything unbolted, one of them is just pushed into a little piece of hose and a hose clamp at the bottom. That's the return. On the other side of the turbo, it was a little harder to getting them to come undone, and the inner one started moving up a tiny bit, but then it was like it was glued in place, so I didn't want to force it and break anything. It shouldn't really matter. I'm gonna replace the manifold and these, but I figured I'll rather stop and take it down and clean the threads. So while I sprayed it a little more and such, I started undoing the clean the push side of the turbo where it feeds air through the intercooler to the intake. it actually came undone quite easily. A couple of hose clamps and that big pipe could be lifted off. New try on that bolt, more heat, and here it started. It's actually here it kind of jammed on the threads, so I took it down and tried to clean the threads with a steel brush a little, and then it came undone a lot easier. And with everything unbolted, the turbo can be lifted off. Started looking at the exhaust manifold itself. A couple of the studs for it are a little longer. Here they had one was broken here, and the one was replaced with a long bolt. It wasn't a stud as it should be, so, and I think that's the reason it's broken, because they have had some of the mounts for it come undone, and the muffler itself have been putting force on the turbo. That's put stress on the exhaust manifold that has cracked. Added heat to most of these bolts also to help them come undone, but actually most of them, the stud came out of the engine block. They needed a little bit of force, but nothing stupid, and it wasn't really feeling like breaking things. A couple on the other side are a little longer also, and holding a sensor for the fire suppression system that's on the machine. The outer nuts came undone quite easily actually, and yeah, sure, they require some force, but so a couple of them felt a little too hard, so sprayed a little more and cleaned up a little before pushing on, getting it undone. Sadly, I found that the bearings in the turbo is quite bad also. It's play both lateral and in the direction on the, I'm not sure exactly where the English words are, but both in and out and sideways you can push the axle in the turbo, so that will need to be addressed. Some heat was added and a little bit of bad sounds, but it still felt like things were moving, so I had brought out a little bit of a longer breaker bar to make it a little easier. A couple of them were behind the diesel heater, so, but it's kind of on a hinge, so it could be bent out of the way without unhooking anything, and the last few nuts could be removed. And with everything removed, a couple of the studs still in place, a little bit of wiggling, and it came out undone. And when you're used to handling exhaust pipes on a motorcycle, maybe this is one hefty piece of exhaust manifold. It's really heavy, but it's cast iron. The couple of studs that were left in there, I locked a couple of nuts on there. I was actually gonna leave them and let it soak for a little bit, but the last one I locked nuts on started moving, so they all came undone really easily. Wanted to get the intake side out of the way also, because I plan on removing all the injectors and have them tested to see that they are okay. Here I ran out the battery a little while removing this, and one of the studs holding the intake in place also holds the ground connection for that heating element on the intake that should help with cold starting, and the stud came undone, and it couldn't be removed because of the ground connection, so I had to clamp it in place with a pipe wrench and be able to remove that stubborn nut, and then the entire intake pipe can be removed. I measured that the heating element here seems to have a good resistance. I haven't checked if it gets current or something, but that could be something also that maybe helps or causes it to be a little cranky at starting. Filled it with some paper to not drop anything down there. Spent some time trying to read any markings on the turbo, but I can't. The numbers I could make out that didn't really help me, so I need to figure out what model the turbo is so I can order some parts for it. Found some website saying that this Sisu CTA 66 engine should possibly use a Switzer S200 turbo, but I have yet to confirm that, and I will see if I can break it apart and get some measurement of the axle, and other things should maybe help out confirming what model it is.